my wife, Karen, and I have always been passionate about adventures and mysteries. When we heard about the legend of the Goatman's Bridge in Denton, Texas, we couldn't resist the temptation to visit it. The bridge, known as Old Alton Bridge, has a dark reputation, filled with stories of sightings and paranormal experiences. Although I've always been skeptical about the supernatural, there was something about this legend that caught our attention. We decided it would be the perfect spot for an autumn night, when the fog was thickest, creating the ideal atmosphere for a spooky adventure. We arrived at the bridge at dusk. The old wooden structure creaked under our feet as we walked, the sound echoing in the night silence. The fog began to rise from the river below the bridge, wrapping everything around us in a dense, white curtain. The air was cold, and the moisture left a light layer of dew on our clothes. Karen pulled out her camera to capture some photos, while I watched the mist spread like icy fingers across the environment. As Karen took photos, I started to feel a strange presence, something I couldn't explain. It was as if the air itself was getting heavier, denser. The feeling of discomfort grew with each passing minute. I decided to ignore it and continued walking across the bridge, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination being influenced by the stories we'd heard about the place. But deep down, something told me there was more to that bridge than just legends. As I tried to push these thoughts aside, I heard footsteps behind me, heavy and rhythmic, as if someone, or something, was approaching. I quickly turned around, expecting to see Karen, but she was farther ahead, completely focused on her camera. The sound of the footsteps continued, now closer, and my heart began to race. Karen must have noticed my unease because she turned to me, but before she could ask what was happening, her eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I could only nod, unable to find words. The footsteps suddenly stopped, and silence returned to the night, a silence so deep it was almost deafening. Then we both saw it. Emerging slowly from the mist, a tall, dark figure began to take shape. At first, it seemed like just a shadow, but as it got closer, I could make out more details. The figure had the shape of a man, but there was something deeply wrong with its appearance. Large horns curved out from its head, and its eyes glowed with a bright red light, as if they were burning with fire. It was the Goatman, the legendary being so many people claimed to have seen on the bridge. Karen tried to capture the image with her camera, but her hands were shaking so much it was hard to focus. I couldn't move, frozen in place by the terrifying sight before me. The figure stood there for a few seconds, just watching us, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished into the mist. It all happened so fast that I found myself questioning whether I had really seen what I thought I had seen. "Did you see that?" Karen asked, her voice barely audible. I could only murmur a yes. Still stunned, we slowly walked back to the car, not saying much. There was a tension in the air we couldn't shake off. When we finally sat in the car, Karen looked at the camera, and her face went pale. "Nathan, you need to see this." On the camera's display, one of the photos Karen had taken on the bridge showed something we hadn't noticed before. In the background of the image, a blurred figure, almost indistinguishable but clearly with horns, was present. The fear I had been trying to suppress exploded inside me. That wasn't an illusion. We had captured something that shouldn't exist, something that couldn't be rationally explained. We left quickly, and the drive home was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I tried to rationalize what we had seen, but nothing made sense. When we got home, Karen and I reviewed the photos several times, becoming more convinced that what we saw was real. For days, that encounter on the bridge haunted us, the vision of the Goatman appearing in our minds every time we closed our eyes. I told our experience to a few friends, but most of them reacted with skepticism, thinking we were just being influenced by the legend stories. But I knew there was something more, something real and terrifying about the Goatman's Bridge. I never returned to that bridge, and to this day, I avoid thinking about what could have happened if that figure had come closer. The experience left me with the feeling that the world is much stranger and more terrifying than I could ever imagine. True horror stories like this make us question everything we believe about what is possible. And now, whenever I hear someone mention the Goatman's Bridge, I get a chill down my spine, reminding me that some legends are not just stories. They are warnings. If you decide to visit Old Alton Bridge, do so with caution. What seems like just an old, quiet bridge may hide secrets that defy logic and sanity. And remember, what's in the mist might be waiting for you. We were a group of 5 inseparable friends, me, Jason, Claire, Mike, Emily, and Tom. Always on the lookout for something exciting to do, we decided one night to explore the famous Goatman's Bridge, or as it's better known, Old Alton Bridge, in Denton, Texas. The local legend always intrigued us, and although we had all heard scary stories about the place, none of us really believed anything supernatural could happen. It was supposed to be just another fun night, full of laughs and maybe a few planned scares. But what we experienced that night went far beyond what we could have imagined. We arrived at the bridge around 11 p.m. The old wooden structure was shrouded in darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the flashlights we brought. The air was heavy and cold, despite it being a summer night. We parked the car a few meters from the bridge, turned off the headlights, and began to walk. The idea was to cross the bridge, explore the surroundings, and then return to the car. Nothing major, just another adventure to tell. As we walked across the bridge, the sound of the wooden planks creaking under our feet seemed amplified by the surrounding silence. Jason, always the prankster of the group, started telling the story of the Goatman, a mythical creature that, according to legend, appears to those who dare cross the bridge at night. He said the Goatman had enormous horns and glowing red eyes and that he would chase those who challenged him. We all laughed, but there was something in the atmosphere that made everyone a little tense. The darkness around us seemed to close in more and more, as if the bridge were swallowing us. In the middle of the crossing, Claire, who had always been the most sensitive in the group, suddenly stopped. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. We all stopped to listen, but there was nothing but silence. We decided to continue, laughing off the tension that was beginning to grow among us. However, when we reached the other side of the bridge, the discomfort was palpable. We crossed, explored the area around us, but no one seemed interested in prolonging the adventure. We resolved to return to the car and call it a night. As we walked back, Mike started talking about how true horror stories sometimes have a basis in reality and that maybe we were provoking something we shouldn't. When we got to the car, everyone was eager to leave. But when Jason turned the key in the ignition, the car simply wouldn't start. He tried several times, but the engine didn't show any signs of life. At first, we thought it was just a mechanical problem, but then we heard something that made our hearts freeze. It came from under the bridge, loud, rhythmic banging, as if something, or someone, was hitting the structure below us. The silence that followed was suffocating. We looked at each other, and the expression of panic was unanimous. Tom was the first to suggest we get out of the car to investigate, but the idea of heading toward the bridge at that moment seemed unbearable. However, the banging continued, insistent, as if something wanted our attention. We had no choice, we needed to know what was happening. With our flashlights trembling in our hands, we got out of the car and approached the bridge. The sound of the banging grew louder as we got closer. I peeked under the bridge, expecting to find some animal or maybe someone trying to scare us, but there was nothing there. The emptiness was absolute, except for the bangs that now seemed to come from all sides, echoing in the silence of the night. Suddenly, the banging stopped. We stood there, motionless, waiting for some sign of what to do next. Claire, who was next to me, grabbed my arm tightly. The fear in her eyes reflected what we all felt at that moment. We were being watched. We didn't know by whom or why, but the feeling was unmistakable. We decided to return to the car, and as soon as everyone was inside, Jason tried to start the car again. To our surprise, the engine started immediately, as if nothing had happened. The urgency to get out of there took over us, and Jason hit the accelerator, driving as fast as he could away from the bridge. The silence in the car was absolute, each of us lost in thoughts about what had happened. The mystery of those bangs and the feeling of being watched were impossible to ignore. We arrived home without saying a word, and only then did we begin to process the night we had. We all agreed that what happened at Goatman's Bridge couldn't be explained rationally. The experience marked us deeply, and none of us talked much about that night again. The legend, which had been just a story before, was now a disturbing reality in our minds. To this day, I avoid crossing bridges at night. Something inside me changed after that experience, something that makes me question the things I've always considered impossible. The Goatman, or whatever was on Old Alton Bridge that night, gave us a warning we will never forget. True terror, the kind you feel deep in your soul, is not something to be trifled with. I've never been someone who is easily impressed. I grew up in Denton, Texas, where the legends about Goatman's Bridge were told like campfire stories, something to scare the kids and entertain the tourists. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and on that particular night, my curiosity led me to a place I wasn't prepared to face. My brother, Jake, always loved exploring creepy places, so it wasn't hard to convince him to accompany me to the bridge. It was an autumn night, the air was crisp, and the sky was clear, perfect for an adventure. We drove to the old bridge, parked the car nearby, and started walking. The bridge itself was eerie at night, with its worn wooden structure and shadows that seemed to move on their own. I wasn't exactly scared, but there was a sense of unease in the air, like we were being watched. Jake, always the fearless one, led the way with a flashlight in hand. We walked across the bridge, talking about the legends and laughing at the idea that we might actually see the Goatman. When we reached the middle of the bridge, Jake suddenly stopped. "Did you see that?" he asked, pointing into the darkness beyond the bridge. I looked where he was pointing, but I didn't see anything. "I didn't see anything," I replied, a bit confused. Jake seemed unsettled. He insisted he saw something moving in the darkness, something he couldn't explain. I was a little worried, but I tried to stay calm, suggesting that maybe it was just an animal. However, as we discussed it, something caught my attention. Small lights began to appear in the darkness around the bridge. They were red and blue, floating in the air as if they had a life of their own. At first, we thought it might be some kind of hunting equipment or maybe flashlights, but it soon became clear that they weren't. The lights moved erratically, quickly changing direction in a way that would be impossible for any normal flashlight. They seemed to be dancing in the air, as if they were playing with us, teasing us to follow them. Jake, always curious, began walking toward the lights. "This can't be normal," he said, more to himself than to me. Reluctantly, I followed him, although part of me was screaming for us to go back to the car. As we got closer, the lights seemed to move away, keeping a safe distance but always visible, as if they were guiding us somewhere. We walked for a few minutes, the tension growing with each step. The lights continued to move, sometimes splitting into several, sometimes merging into a single source of light. At one point, the lights moved so quickly that we almost lost track of them, but then, suddenly, they stopped. They stayed there, floating in the darkness, as if they were waiting for us. Jake stopped, finally realizing that something was very wrong. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured. I could see the fear in his eyes, something I rarely saw in him. When we decided it was time to go back, the lights simply disappeared, as if they had never been there. We stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Everything around us was silent, almost as if the world itself had stopped. Without further hesitation, we started walking back to the bridge. The feeling of unease had turned into pure dread. I looked back several times, expecting to see those lights again, but there was nothing but darkness. When we finally reached the car, we quickly got in, slamming the doors shut. Jake tried to laugh, trying to break the tension, but the laughter died in his throat. As we drove away from the bridge, we didn't say anything. We both knew that what we saw was not something we could explain. The lights, the way they moved, how they seemed to guide us, none of it made sense. When we got home, we finally allowed ourselves to talk about the experience, but no explanation seemed satisfying. In the days that followed, the memory of that night haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about the lights, about what they could be. Jake and I researched the bridge, trying to find some similar accounts, but nothing compared to what we experienced. Some said the lights could be some kind of natural phenomenon, others suggested they were lost souls, but nothing made sense. Jake, who was always the most skeptical, avoided talking about it, which told me how much it had affected him. For me, the experience changed something inside of me. I always thought legends were just stories, but now, I'm not so sure. Goatman's Bridge is a place that holds dark secrets, and we got just a glimpse of what hides in the darkness. Since that night, I've avoided going near the bridge. Something about that place is different, something that makes me feel like we shouldn't mess with the unknown. The lights we saw that night continue to haunt me, a mystery that might never be solved. But one thing is certain, what happened on Old Alton Bridge was not normal, and I know I wasn't the only one to leave there deeply disturbed. That night seemed perfect for a little adventure with my friends. We were all gathered in Denton, Texas, and someone suggested we visit the famous Goatman's Bridge. The idea of visiting a place surrounded by so many urban legends was tempting, especially for a group of friends who love to challenge themselves in scary situations. I was never easily impressed, but there was something about crossing that bridge at night that made me uneasy. Still, I decided it would be fun, so we went ahead. We arrived at Old Alton Bridge around 10 p.m. The drive there was smooth, full of laughter and teasing. The bridge was shrouded in deep darkness, only partially illuminated by the moon. When we got out of the car, the silence around us seemed almost palpable. The sound of our footsteps was muffled by the wooden floor of the bridge, and the only thing we could hear was the rustling of the leaves in the surrounding trees. I felt a little isolated, as if the world had drifted away, leaving us alone in that spot of darkness. I was in the middle of the group as we crossed the bridge, but at some point, I drifted a bit away from the others. Something caught my attention in the shadows ahead, a strange sensation, as if someone or something was watching us. I paused for a second, looking around, trying to identify what had changed. That's when I felt the touch. It was a cold sensation, almost as if an invisible hand had closed over my shoulder. My first reaction was to think that one of my friends was trying to scare me, so I turned around quickly, ready to laugh and confront them. But there was no one near me. Everyone was a few meters away, talking among themselves, completely unaware of what I had just felt. The touch wasn't just cold, it was heavy, as if something was trying to pull me back, away from the group. My heart started to race. I stood still for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. I looked at my friends, and for a second, I thought about calling out to them, but I hesitated. I didn't want to seem like the scared one in the group, especially since everything seemed to be going fine until that moment. So, I decided to ignore the sensation and kept walking, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it all. But something inside me was on alert. Every step I took felt like it was being accompanied by an invisible presence, as if something was following me. I kept walking, keeping my eyes fixed on my friends ahead, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. But the truth was, fear was starting to set in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When we finally reached the other side of the bridge, we stopped to rest and take some pictures. Everyone was excited, talking about how the bridge seemed scarier than they had imagined. But I could hardly focus on the conversation. My mind was fixated on that touch, that cold, heavy sensation that still seemed to cling to me. It wasn't just a physical feeling, it was something that penetrated my mind, leaving me uneasy and disturbed. I stood a bit apart from the group, looking back at the bridge, trying to see if there was something that could explain what I had felt. But the bridge was empty, wrapped in shadows. And then, I felt that touch again. This time, it was more intense, as if something was holding on to me more firmly, trying to pull me back. I turned suddenly, expecting to see someone, but again, there was nothing. My whole body tensed, and a chill ran down my spine. I looked around, trying to find an explanation, but all I saw was darkness. My breathing became heavy, and I realized I couldn't stay there anymore. I needed to get out of that place. I called my friends, trying to keep calm, but my voice came out shaky. They noticed something was wrong, and soon we were all back in the car, ready to leave. As we drove away from the bridge, a sense of relief began to wash over me, but the fear was still there, lurking. My friends asked what had happened, but I couldn't explain exactly. How do you explain that you felt something you couldn't see, something that touched you and left you terrified? I tried to describe the touch, the sensation of being pulled back, but the more I talked, the more unreal it seemed. When I finally got home that night, I thought the fear would go away, but it didn't. In fact, the feeling that something was wrong continued to haunt me. I slept poorly, waking up several times with the impression that I still felt that cold touch on my shoulder. In the days that followed, I tried to forget what had happened, but the experience left a mark on me that I didn't expect. What I felt on that bridge cannot be explained rationally. It was something that made me question everything I believed about the supernatural. The idea that something invisible, something I can't explain, might have tried to pull me back that night is something that still deeply frightens me. Since then, I avoid places like Goatman's Bridge. I don't want to risk feeling that touch again. If you decide to visit Old Alton Bridge, be prepared for the unexpected. Sometimes, what we feel is more real than what we can see, and there are things in this world that defy logic and reason. What happened to me that night was real, and it's something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. So, be careful what you seek, you may end up finding more than you bargained for. I'm not someone who scares easily. I grew up listening to ghost stories, watching scary movies, and laughing at the urban legends my grandmother used to tell. But that night, something happened that shook that confidence. Something that still makes me think twice before crossing any bridge at night. It was late, around 11 at night, when I decided to take a walk. I was visiting some friends in Denton, Texas, and had heard about the famous Goatman's Bridge, Old Alton Bridge. Everyone in town seemed to know the story, a legend of a horned creature that haunts the bridge and terrorizes those who dare to cross it at night. Of course, I didn't believe any of it, but curiosity got the better of me. I thought it would be fun to stop by before heading home. I arrived at the bridge and parked the car a short distance away. The night was dark, moonless, and the only light came from distant street lamps that barely illuminated the path to the bridge. As I walked, the darkness seemed to close in around me, muffling all sounds except for the sound of my own footsteps on the wooden floor of the bridge. The air was cold and damp, and I could feel the soft wind passing through the planks. I started to cross the bridge, with each step echoing in the quiet surroundings. It was almost soothing, the rhythmic sound of my feet hitting the wood. But when I was about halfway across the bridge, something changed. I heard footsteps. Not mine, but others, echoing behind me. They were heavy, solid, as if someone was following me. My first reaction was to stop. I stood still, waiting for the person to catch up with me. Maybe it was another curious person like me, wanting to see the bridge at night. But when I stopped, the footsteps also stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I looked back, expecting to see someone, but there was no one. Just thick darkness and shadows that seemed to dance around. That sense of tranquility vanished in an instant. My heart began to beat faster, and a cold sensation crawled up my spine. I decided to keep walking, a little faster this time, thinking maybe I was imagining things. But as soon as I took the first step, the footsteps behind me started again, following me at the same pace. By this point, fear was starting to take over. I looked back again, but the result was the same, nothing but darkness. I kept walking, trying to stay calm, but the feeling of being followed was impossible to ignore. Every step I took was followed by another, perfectly synchronized, as if an invisible shadow was accompanying me, mimicking my every move. I began to walk faster, trying to reach the other side of the bridge as quickly as possible. But no matter how fast I went, the footsteps continued behind me, like a shadow that refused to leave me. The only thing I could think about was getting out of there. Panic began to set in, and my steps quickened to almost a run, but the footsteps kept pace, close, relentless. Finally, when I reached the end of the bridge, the footsteps abruptly stopped, as if the bridge was a barrier for whatever was following me. I looked back one last time, my heart racing and my whole body trembling, but the bridge was empty, silent. The only sound now was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Without thinking twice, I ran back to the car. I got in quickly, locking the doors with an automatic impulse, as if that could protect me from something I couldn't see. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath and convince myself that it was all just a trick of my mind, an illusion caused by fear. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. What I felt on that bridge was real, the footsteps that echoed behind me, the sensation of being followed by something that couldn't be seen. All of it made me question what I had always believed to be impossible. When I finally mustered the courage to start the car and drive away, one last look at the bridge revealed only shadows. The road ahead was long, but I couldn't forget what had happened. I returned to my friend's house but said nothing. How could I explain something like that without sounding crazy? The fear I felt that night was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. It wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was fear of the unexplainable. Since then, I avoid talking about that night, but the memory remains clear. Old Alton Bridge is more than just an urban legend. It's a place where the unexplainable seems to take shape, where dark pasts and horror stories come to life in ways we can't understand. I've always been a curious person, drawn to mysterious places and scary stories. So when my friends suggested a visit to the famous Goatman's Bridge, I didn't hesitate to accept. It was an autumn night, perfect for a walk under the full moon, and the idea of exploring a place so full of urban legends seemed like the perfect opportunity to feed our adrenaline. We arrived at Old Alton Bridge around 10 p.m. The air was crisp, and the only light illuminating the bridge was the moonlight. The environment was silent, except for the sound of our footsteps on the wooden bridge and the muffled laughter of my friends. The setting was perfect for a night of fun and scares, and everything seemed to go according to plan. We walked across the bridge, laughing and telling scary stories we had heard over the years. We were all in a lighthearted mood, teasing and provoking each other about who would be the first to see the famous Goatman. The bridge itself was old and had an imposing presence, as if it had been built to guard dark secrets. As we crossed, I began to feel a slight unease. It was as if the air around us had changed, becoming heavier, denser. The feeling was subtle, but I couldn't help but notice it. I followed the group in silence for a few minutes, trying to push aside the uncomfortable sensation that was starting to grow inside me. Suddenly, I heard something that made me stop. A male voice, soft and calm, calling my name. Sarah. The voice seemed to come from nearby, almost as if someone was standing next to me, whispering my name into the wind. I quickly looked at my friends, but they were all ahead of me, laughing and talking among themselves. No one seemed to have noticed anything. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wasn't the type to scare easily, but there was something about that voice that made me freeze. It continued to call my name, insistently, as if trying to draw me to something. The sound was so clear, so real, that I began to look around, expecting to see someone approaching. I called out to one of my friends, asking if he had heard anything, but he just shook his head, confused. "Heard what?" he asked, visibly unconcerned. No one else seemed to hear the voice, which only increased my discomfort. It was as if that voice was meant only for me, a private call that others couldn't perceive. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that my mind was playing tricks on me because of the stories we had heard. But the voice persisted, calm but insistent. "Sarah. Come." I could swear it was getting closer, as if the person was right beside me, trying to make me respond. While my friends continued to walk, feeling at ease on the bridge, I began to feel increasingly trapped in that situation. The voice wouldn't stop, and every time I looked around, expecting to see someone, all I found was darkness. Fear began to set in, replacing the fun I had initially felt. Finally, I decided I couldn't continue any longer. I asked my friends to go back to the car, claiming I was feeling unwell. They noticed something was wrong, and although reluctant, they agreed to end the adventure. As we moved away from the bridge, the voice began to fade, as if it was giving up on reaching me. When we finally left the bridge, the voice stopped. The silence that followed was almost deafening, and I felt an immediate relief when I realized the sound had disappeared. I looked back one last time, and the bridge looked as ordinary as any other, but I knew something unexplainable had happened that night. On the way back home, I tried to explain the situation to my friends, but none of them seemed to understand. How could I explain that a voice called my name, but no one else heard it? They laughed, saying I was just scared by the stories, but I knew there was something more. Something on that bridge was trying to reach me, to lure me. The following days were filled with a sense of discomfort. The memory of that voice followed me, haunting my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something on that bridge had tried to pull me to a place I didn't want to go. As the days passed, I tried to put that night behind me, but the memory of that voice never completely disappeared. It still echoes in my mind from time to time, a constant reminder that not everything can be explained. That night on Old Alton Bridge taught me that no matter how much we try to rationalize the unknown, there are things that simply don't fit into our worldview. Since then, I avoid places that carry such dark stories. I've learned that some experiences are more disturbing than they seem at first glance, and that certain places hold secrets that might be better left undiscovered. The voice that called me on that bridge is one of those secrets, a mystery I prefer not to revisit. If you decide to explore Old Alton Bridge, do so with caution, because not everything you find will be something that can be easily forgotten. It was a typical summer night in Texas, hot and muggy, when my friends and I decided to do something different. We had heard so many stories about Old Alton Bridge, the famous Goatman's Bridge, that we thought it would be fun to make a nighttime visit. I, Mark, Kelly, Jason, and Emily, all of us were looking for a little adrenaline rush, and the destination seemed perfect. After all, who doesn't love a good urban legend to spice up the night? We left home around 10 at night, full of energy and laughter. The bridge was just a few minutes' drive away, and all along the way, we talked about the bizarre stories surrounding the place. Legends of apparitions, strange sounds, and of course, the infamous Goatman, a creature that supposedly roamed the bridge at night. To us, it was all part of a big joke. When we arrived at the bridge, the air was heavy, almost suffocating. We parked the car a few meters away and started walking. The bridge was shrouded in darkness, lit only by the faint light of our flashlights. The silence around us was absolute, broken only by the sound of our footsteps echoing on the old wood. The setting was perfect for a scare or two. As we walked, Kelly began talking about one of the most famous stories about the bridge, that if you called out to the Goatman, he would come to you. Jason, always the bravest of the group, decided we should give it a try. He turned toward the dark abyss under the bridge and shouted, "Goatman, come and get us." We all laughed nervously, but the truth is, none of us expected a response. That's when we heard it. A low sound, almost imperceptible at first, as if coming from far away. It sounded like the bleating of a goat, but there was something strange about that sound, something that made each of us stop laughing instantly. We fell silent, trying to understand what we were hearing. The sound grew louder, closer, as if several goats were under the bridge, bleating in unison. We looked at each other, confused. There were no farms or goats nearby, we were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded only by trees and darkness. Jason, always curious, suggested we go down to see what was causing the noise. Emily, on the other hand, was clearly uncomfortable with the idea. She insisted we should leave, that something wasn't right. But curiosity won out, and we decided to investigate. We descended from the bridge, guided by the light of our flashlights. The sound of the bleating continued, now louder and clearer, as if the goats were right below us. Every step we took seemed to bring us closer to the source of the sound, but something was wrong. There was no sign of life there, only oppressive darkness and the persistent sound. When we finally reached the area under the bridge, the sound stopped abruptly. We stood there, frozen, in a silence that felt heavier than before. I looked around, trying to find some explanation, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of goats, absolutely nothing that could explain that sound. It was as if the goats, if they were goats, had disappeared into thin air. Jason, trying to keep things light, suggested that maybe we had scared the animals away, but I could see in his eyes that he was also disturbed. Kelly and Mark were silent, something rare for them. The only one who seemed relieved was Emily, who was clearly anxious to leave as quickly as possible. I silently agreed with her, something about that bridge wasn't right, something we couldn't explain. We decided to head back to the car, no more joking around. The way back seemed much longer than before, as if the darkness around us was trying to keep us there. When we finally reached the car, everyone got in quickly, and Jason started the engine without hesitation. No one spoke on the drive back. The sound of the bleeding still echoed in my mind, a disturbing reminder that something had gone wrong that night. Later that night, when everyone was back at their homes, we talked about the experience. None of us could find a rational explanation for what had happened. The sound, so clear and real, made no sense. We tried to come up with some logic, maybe a prank by someone or some kind of collective hallucination, but none of these theories seemed to hold up. In the days that followed, I tried not to think too much about what happened. But the truth is, the experience marked me in a way I didn't expect. Every time I hear a similar sound, even if it's something trivial like the sound of an animal in the distance, I'm taken back to that night. The feeling of discomfort, the fear of the unknown, it all comes rushing back in an instant. If you ever think about visiting Goatman's Bridge, be prepared for the unexpected. There are mysteries that shouldn't be provoked, sounds that can't be explained. And if you hear something strange, like the bleating of goats where there should be none, it might be best not to try to find out where it's coming from. Some questions are better left unanswered, especially in places like that. I'm a guy who has always been skeptical of the supernatural. I grew up in a small town in Texas where legends and ghost stories were part of the local folklore, but to me, those stories were just that, stories. Until the night something happened on the road leading to Old Alton Bridge, better known as Goatman's Bridge. What I saw that night completely changed my perspective and, honestly, still gives me chills just thinking about it. It was a Friday night, and I was driving home after a long day at work. The drive home had always been peaceful, but it took me along a road that, in recent months, had gained a dark reputation due to strange reports. I never paid much attention to these reports. They talked about a mysterious figure appearing in the middle of the road, forcing drivers to brake suddenly. But when they approached, the figure would disappear. Until then, to me, this was nothing more than the fertile imagination of people who like to create scary stories. That night, I was more tired than usual. The road was deserted, and the only light came from my car's headlights, cutting through the darkness. It was a long, straight stretch, surrounded by trees that, at night, seemed to stretch on forever. I was driving at a steady pace, just waiting to get home and finally rest. That's when something caught my attention in the middle of the road. A tall, dark figure seemed to be standing in the middle of the path, as if waiting for me. At first, I thought it was a deer or some large animal, something common in the area, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't an animal. It was something different. The figure had a human silhouette, but something was deeply wrong. There were horns that stood out against the faint glow of my headlights, curving upward from a head that didn't seem entirely human. My heart began to beat faster, and my instinct made me hit the brakes, causing the car to stop abruptly. Panic took hold of me, and for a second, I stood still, trying to process what I was seeing. The figure didn't move. It seemed to be watching me, standing in the middle of the road like a statue, but there was something threatening in its posture. It was as if it was deliberately blocking the way, waiting for me to make a move. The air around me seemed to grow colder, and a sense of dread began to settle inside me. All I wanted was for that thing to disappear. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, and prepared to move forward slowly, hoping the figure would move out of the way. But before I could do anything, the figure simply vanished. 1 second it was there, the next, nothing, as if it had never existed. I blinked several times, trying to understand what had just happened. My mind struggled to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. I stayed there for a few more seconds, waiting for the figure to reappear, but the road was completely empty. The silence was almost suffocating, and the only sound was my own heavy breathing. I decided to move on, but the unease stayed with me for the rest of the drive home. What had I seen? Had it been a hallucination caused by exhaustion? But the image of that horned figure was so vividly etched in my mind that I couldn't simply dismiss it. I got home, but the experience continued to torment me. I told a few friends what had happened, hoping they would laugh and give me a simple explanation, but everyone fell silent, visibly uncomfortable. Some even mentioned that they had heard of others who had seen something similar on that road, which only increased my anxiety. What could that figure be? Could it really be the Goatman from the local legends? In the following weeks, the image of that dark figure and its horns wouldn't leave my mind. The idea that something so strange and unexplainable could cross my path on an ordinary night made me question everything. I had never been one to believe in ghosts or supernatural creatures, but now, doubt was planted in my mind. I decided to investigate more about the Goatman legend and the reports of sightings on the road. I found out that I wasn't the only one who had seen the figure. Other drivers also reported slamming on their brakes when they saw the same thing, only to watch it disappear before their eyes. Some said the figure was a warning, a harbinger of something bad, while others believed it was a manifestation of something evil, trapped in that area. Whatever the truth is, one thing is certain, that road has never been the same for me. Whenever I have to drive there at night, I stay on high alert, expecting the horned figure to reappear. The fear of encountering it again stays with me, and even when nothing happens, the tension is palpable. Now, I'm more cautious about dismissing horror stories as mere legends. That encounter on the road taught me that there are things in the world that defy logic and reason. What I saw that night showed me that the unexplainable is closer than we imagine, and sometimes, it reveals itself when we least expect it. If you're driving on that road leading to Goatman's Bridge, stay alert. You might be lucky enough to see nothing, but if you do spot something in the middle of the road, don't try to find an immediate explanation. Just keep moving, and hope that whatever is there disappears as quickly as it appeared. It was a sunny autumn day when my friends and I decided to explore the area around Old Alton Bridge. The bridge, better known as Goatman's Bridge, was already famous for its macabre stories, but we weren't the type to be intimidated by urban legends. That day, there was no rush, and the sunlight gave us a false sense of security, as if nothing bad could happen while the afternoon still shone on us. There were 5 of us: me, Lucas, Emma, Jared, and Michelle. The idea was to spend the day outdoors, explore the place, and maybe return with some stories to tell. We crossed the bridge without much excitement, just joking about the legends and taking some photos to document the visit. Everything seemed normal until then, just another adventure among friends. After crossing the bridge, we decided to go down to the edge of the creek that ran beneath it. The water flowed calmly, reflecting the blue sky above. We sat for a while on the rocks, chatting and skipping stones, seeing who could make the most skips. The tranquility of the place was almost hypnotic, a total contrast to the dark stories surrounding the bridge. That's when something strange happened. I was the first to notice, but I hesitated to believe what my eyes were seeing. On the surface of the water, something seemed to move, as if the shadows of the trees were playing with the sunlight. But as I looked closer, I realized they weren't shadows, they were faces. Human faces, submerged, distorted by the gentle current, but clearly visible. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just leaves or some strange reflection in the water. But the faces didn't disappear, and instead, they seemed to be staring at me, with expressions ranging from sadness to despair. I called the others, trying to stay calm, but my voice came out shaky. "Guys, are you seeing this?" Lucas was the first to come closer, and when he looked at the water, his face went pale. "Man, what is that?" he asked, but no one had an answer. Emma, Jared, and Michelle quickly gathered around, and panic began to spread among us. The faces were there, floating just below the surface, moving slightly with the current but not disappearing. We tried to understand what we were seeing. Could it be some kind of optical illusion? But the more we looked, the clearer it became that those faces were real in some way, even if inexplicable. Michelle pulled out her phone, trying to take pictures, but as soon as she raised the device, the faces began to fade, as if they knew we were trying to capture them. We stayed there for a few minutes, unable to take our eyes off the water, but the faces didn't return. The water now looked normal, as if nothing had happened. But we had all seen the same thing, and the look of fear on my friends' faces reflected exactly what I was feeling. Something wasn't right. Something about that place was beyond our understanding. We decided to leave as quickly as possible. What started as a fun adventure had turned into a disturbing experience that no one wanted to prolong. We quickly climbed back up the bank and crossed the bridge again in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The feeling of unease was almost tangible, as if something was following us, watching us as we left. On the way back, we tried to discuss what we had seen, but no one had a logical explanation. It was as if the place itself had shown us something we weren't supposed to see, something that should have remained hidden. The idea that those faces might belong to people who met their end in that creek terrified us, but at the same time, no one wanted to say it out loud. We reached the car and left immediately, leaving the bridge behind, but the feeling that we weren't alone stayed with us the entire way back home. What did we see in that water? Was it something real, or had our collective imagination played a trick on us? Those questions haunted us for days, and to this day, I can't look at a creek without remembering those distorted faces. The experience changed the way I see places like Old Alton Bridge. Before, urban legends were just stories to me, but now, I know there's something more. Something that can't be easily explained, something that makes us question the reality around us. Since that day, I avoid going back to that place, and whenever I pass by any bridge or creek, I can't help but look at the water, fearing to see those faces staring back at me again. What happened to us that afternoon is something I'll never forget. It was an experience that shook all of us and made me realize that the world is much stranger and more disturbing than I ever imagined. If you ever decide to explore the area around Goatman's Bridge, be prepared to see things you can't explain and that you may never be able to forget. Because some things, once seen, can never be undone. If you enjoyed this real ghost story, you can't miss 7 horrifying cases of ghosts and demons. To watch, click on the video here in the card or search for the previous video on this channel. And, of course, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments if you've had a paranormal experience too. Stay brave and until the next scary story.